Learn English through story. The last letter from you. The ink had barely dried when Eleanor folded the letter with trembling fingers. Her breath shallow, her pulse a slow, aching throb in her wrists. The paper felt impossibly thin between her hands, fragile as the memories pressing against the walls of her mind. She hesitated, tracing the edges as if the act itself could hold back the inevitable. But she knew there was no stopping time, no rewriting the past. She placed the letter into the envelope and sealed it with a quiet finality. The weight of it felt heavier than it should, heavier than paper and ink, heavier than mere words. She set it on the windowsill beside a vase of wilting lily, the soft petals curling inward, retreating from the world as if they carried a secret. The city outside hummed with life, indifferent to the quiet reckoning inside her small apartment. Cars slipped through the streets, headlights flickering against rain-streaked pavement. Voices rose in conversation, laughter echoed from distant alleyways. But within these walls, there was only silence. Eleanor sat back in her chair, hands folded in her lap, staring at the letter as if it might change under her gaze. It wouldn't. It couldn't. She had written the truth at least. The version of it she could finally admit to. And now, all that remained was to send it. But to whom? That was the question that had kept her awake for months. She had addressed it to Daniel Whitmore, a name she had not spoken aloud in years. Not since the night she had walked away from the love they had built, leaving behind nothing but an unspoken promise and the echo of her footsteps on wet pavement. She had believed, then, that some distances could never be crossed again, that some words were best left unspoken. But regret had a way of lingering, filling the quiet spaces between heartbeats, whispering in the dark. And now she had written to him, though she did not know if he would ever read it. Eleanor exhaled slowly, pressing her fingertips against her temple. She closed her eyes, allowing memory to take her. Eleanor had once believed in the illusion of time, that it stretched endlessly be for her, offering infinite chances to make amends, to say the things left unsaid. But time was cruel in its quiet unraveling, stealing away moments until all that remained were echoes of what could have been. She stood, smoothing the wrinkles from her dress, and reached for the letter. The envelope felt heavier now, as if the weight of all her unsent words had finally settled into the ink. She hesitated only a moment before tucking it into her coat pocket, pressing it against her chest as if proximity could give her courage. Outside, the air was thick with the scent of damp pavement and autumn leaves. The streetlights flickered above her as she walked, each step an echo of memories she had tried so hard to bury. Daniel had always told her that life was too short for regrets, that honesty, no matter how painful, was better than silence. And yet, she had chosen silence. She had chosen to walk away. The post office was a short distance away, but tonight it felt like a pilgrimage. With every step, she imagined his face, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed, the way his voice had once been the only thing that could steady her when the world felt too much. She had never meant to hurt him, and yet she had. At the corner, she paused, her fingers tightening around the letter. The blue mailbox stood before her, unassuming, yet it held the power to change everything. Could she do this? Would he even want to hear from her? Would he remember the way she had left, not with an explanation, not with closure, but with the silence that had stretched between them for years? She traced the outline of his name through the envelope, her breath uneven. Then, with a final inhale, she slipped the letter into the slot. The soft sound of paper against metal was deafening. It was done. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling both relief and an unfamiliar ache bloom within her. The past had been set into motion, no longer confined to her memory alone. She turned and walked away, not knowing that in a small town miles away, Daniel Whitmore would receive a letter that would change everything. The night air wrapped around Eleanor like an old memory cold, persistent, refusing to let go. She stood at the street corner, staring at the mailbox as if it might suddenly return her letter, as if she might be given a second chance to change her mind. But the letter was gone, swallowed by the dark metal slot. Now, hurtling toward a destination that felt further than mere miles. She pulled her coat tighter around herself and turned away. The past was no longer just inside her head. It had been set free into the world, carried on ink and paper, toward the only person who had ever truly known her. Would he even read it? Would he even care? Eleanor tried not to let her mind spiral into the endless what-ifs that had haunted her for years. Instead, she focused on the pavement beneath her feet, the rhythm of her boots clicking against the stone. She passed a bookstore, where a young couple lingered in the warm glow of a window display, fingers tracing the spines of novels as they whispered to each other. A street musician played a soft tune on his violin at the corner, his case open for coins, but his eyes lost in the music. Life went on, even when hearts were broken, even when words remained unsaid. She walked until her legs ached, until she found herself back at her apartment building, standing at the threshold of a space that had once felt like an escape but now felt unbearably small. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old books and unfinished coffee, remnants of a life spent in quiet solitude. She shrugged off her coat, let it slide onto the chair by the door, and sat by the window. Rain began to fall, tapping softly against the glass. She rested her forehead against the cool surface, watching droplets race down in uneven patterns. It was a small thing, but in that moment, it reminded her of Daniel, of the way he used to watch the rain with her, of the way he'd once traced idle patterns on her skin as they lay together in the quiet hours of the night. She closed her eyes, and suddenly she was back there. It had been late autumn, much like tonight, when she had last seen him. The air had smelled of burning wood and crisp leaves, and the city had been alive with the glow of street lamps reflecting off wet pavement. They had walked in silence, side by side, their hands almost touching but never quite meeting. Daniel had known something was wrong. "You're quiet tonight," he had said, his voice careful, as if he were afraid that pushing too hard would make her disappear. Eleanor had hesitated, the words on the tip of her tongue, words she had rehearsed 1,000 times but could never bring herself to say. Instead, she had offered a small, sad smile. "I just have a lot on my mind." Daniel had stopped walking then, turning to face her. His dark eyes had searched hers, looking for answers she wasn't ready to give. "You can tell me, you know, whatever it is." But she hadn't. She had swallowed the truth, pressed it down into the space between them, hoping that silence would be easier than explanation. It hadn't been. She had left that night without saying goodbye, without looking back. And now, years later, the weight of that choice still sat heavy on her chest. Eleanor opened her eyes, exhaling slowly. It was too late to change the past. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to say what should have been said. Miles away, Daniel Whitmore had always believed in moving forward. He had spent years building a life from the pieces of his past, refusing to dwell on what had been lost. Some things, he told himself, were simply meant to fade. And yet, as he sat at his kitchen table on a quiet Saturday morning, staring at an envelope with handwriting he hadn't seen in years, he felt the past pressing against his ribs, threatening to crack through the carefully constructed walls around his heart. The letter had arrived with the rest of his mail, tucked between bills and advertisements, unassuming in its presence but seismic in its impact. His name was written in familiar strokes, careful and deliberate, as if the writer had hesitated before each letter. Eleanor. Her name had been a ghost in his life, a whisper in the back of his mind that he had long learned to ignore. She had left without explanation, without a word, and he had told himself that it didn't matter, that he had moved on. But as he turned the envelope over in his hands, he realized just how much of a lie that had been. His fingers hovered over the seal. He could tear it open, let her words spill into his life like a flood. Or he could throw it away, pretend it had never arrived, keep his walls intact. He closed his eyes, inhaled sharply, and then, with a steadying breath, he broke the seal. The paper inside was thin, the ink slightly smudged in places, as if her hand had trembled while writing. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes tracing the first line. "Daniel, there are things I should have told you years ago. I don't know if this letter will mean anything to you now, but I need you to know the truth. The words blurred for a moment as he stared at them, his chest tightening. The past had come knocking, and this time he wasn't sure if he had the strength to turn it away. Daniel's fingers trembled slightly as he held the letter, the weight of Eleanor's words pressing against his chest like an unseen force. He hadn't expected this, not after all these years. The silence between them had stretched along, grown into an unbridgeable distance. Or so he had thought. He leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding against his ribs. The morning sun streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the kitchen table. illuminating the letter in his hands. He took a deep breath and forced himself to keep reading. I know I don't have the right to ask for your forgiveness. I walked away without an explanation. And I can't erase the years of silence that followed. But there are things I never told you, things I should have said before I left. I don't expect you to understand, but I hope that, at the very least, you'll hear me out. Daniel exhaled slowly, his grip tightening on the paper. The past rushed toward him in waves, threatening to pull him under. He remembered the last night he had seen her, the way she had looked at him. Her eyes filled with something unreadable. He had sensed it then, the way people sense a storm before it breaks. He had asked her what was wrong. She had only given him that small, sad smile. And then she was gone. No warning, no explanation. For months, he had replayed their last conversations in his mind, searching for signs he had missed, clues hidden in the spaces between her words. He had told himself that maybe she had needed to leave, that maybe she had her reasons. But the hurt had lingered, settling into the quiet corners of his life. And now, after all this time, she was writing to him. He turned his eyes back to the letter. The truth is, I left because I was afraid. Not of you, but of what loving you meant. You saw parts of me that I wasn't ready to face. You loved me in a way that made me feel exposed, vulnerable. And I told myself that if I walked away first, I could control the outcome, that it would hurt less. But I was wrong. I've spent every day since then carrying the weight of what I didn't say. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, frustration and sorrow tangling inside him. So that was it, fear. She had left because she had been afraid of what they had, afraid of love itself. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to throw the letter aside, to tell himself that it was too late, that her explanations meant nothing now. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. Because the truth was, he had never really let her go. Eleanor sat in her apartment, staring at the empty space where the letter had once been. A part of her wished she had never sent it. But another part of her, quieter, more desperate part, knew that she had needed to. The past had followed her for too long. It was time to face it. She had spent the last few years moving through life in a careful, measured way, avoiding anything that might stir the memories she had buried. Work, books, the occasional polite conversation with a neighbour. She had built a world that was predictable, safe. But it had also been lonely. And Daniel had been the one person who had ever truly seen her. She had told herself, for years, that she had done the right thing by leaving, that she had spared them both a greater pain. But was that true? Had she saved them from heartbreak, or had she simply prolonged it? She stood and walked to the window, pressing her fingertips against the cool glass. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening in the lamplight. Somewhere, miles away, Daniel was reading her words. Would he respond? Did she even deserve a response? A sharp knock at the door startled her. She turned, her pulse quickening. She wasn't expecting anyone. For a brief, impossible moment, she let herself imagine that it was Daniel, that he had read her letter, gotten on a plane, and come to find her. But that was foolish. She crossed the room and opened the door. It was her neighbour, an elderly woman named Mrs. Langley, holding a small tin of cookies. I thought you might like these, Mrs. Langley said with a warm smile. Eleanor hesitated before offering a grateful nod. That's very kind of you. Mrs. Langley studied her with knowing eyes. You look like you've got something heavy on your mind, dear. Eleanor swallowed. Something like that. The older woman chuckled softly. The past has a way of knocking on our doors when we least expect it. Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest. She nodded, unable to find the words to respond. Mrs. Langley patted her arm gently. Whatever it is, you'll find your way through it. Eleanor forced a small smile. I hope so. As she closed the door, she clutched the tin of cookies to her chest, feeling the weight of her thoughts settle in once more. She had sent the letter. Now, all she could do was wait. Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat in his living room, the letter resting on the coffee table in front of him. He had read it 3 times now, each word sinking deeper into his chest. Eleanor, the woman who had left without a word. The woman he had once loved more than anything. The woman he had never truly stopped loving. He rubbed his temples, exhaling sharply. What was he supposed to do with this? Should he write back? Should he call her? Should he ignore it entirely and pretend that none of this had ever happened? A part of him wanted to. A part of him wanted to shove the letter into a drawer and let it collect. Just like an old memory? But another part of him, a part he had spent years trying to silence, wanted answers. Why now? Why, after all this time, had she chosen to reach out? He leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second stretching the distance between them. He needed time to think, but deep down, he already knew the truth. He wasn't ready to let go of Eleanor Whitmore. Not yet. This is just the next step in their journey. And there's so much more to explore: the push and pull of their emotions, their memories, and the moral lesson about the weight of unspoken words, and the power of second chances. The night stretched long for Daniel, his apartment feeling both too small and too vast at the same time. He had read Eleanor's letter over and over, yet no matter how many times he traced the careful strokes of her handwriting, the ache in his chest refused to subside. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, rubbing a hand over his face. He wasn't sure what frustrated him, more the fact that she had finally reached out, or the fact that, despite everything, he still cared. He had built a life after her. He had convinced himself that he was over the way she had left. That time had dulled the edges of his pain. And yet, the moment her words reached him, the years dissolved like mist, leaving only the raw, open wound beneath. She had been afraid. That was why she left. It should have made sense. It should have been enough. But it wasn't, because fear didn't justify the silence. He glanced at his phone on the table, the screen dark. He could call her. He could demand answers. He could pour out the hurt that had been buried beneath his skin for years. But he didn't. Instead, he stood, pacing toward the window. The city sprawled beneath him, alive with a million stories unfolding all at once. Somewhere, Eleanor was waiting. Maybe she thought he would never respond. Maybe she had accepted that possibility even before she wrote the letter. He exhaled. She had taken the first step. Now, the next move was his. Eleanor. The days passed in agonizing silence. Eleanor tried to go about her routine as if nothing had changed. But something had. The letter was gone. The words she had held inside for years had finally been spoken, written down, sent out into the world. But what if they weren't enough? She checked her phone too often, her heart leaping at every notification, only to sink when it was never him. The mailbox outside her building became an obsession. Every time she passed it, she found herself glancing inside, as if a reply might suddenly appear. Nothing. Days turned into a week, then another. She told herself she had expected this. Daniel owed her nothing. He had every right to ignore her letter, to move on with his life the way she had forced him to all those years ago. But knowing that didn't make the waiting any easier. One evening, as she sat curled up on her couch with a book she had barely touched, her phone buzzed. Her pulse jumped as she reached for it, fingers suddenly unsteady. The screen lit up with a name she never thought she'd see again. Daniel Whitmore. She stared at it, heart pounding. For a second, she considered not answering. It was ridiculous she had waited for this moment, longed for it. But now that it was here, fear gripped her throat. What if he was calling to say he wanted nothing to do with her? What if he was calling just to end things, to close this chapter once and for all? The phone kept ringing. With a deep breath, she pressed answer. A silence stretched between them for a second before his voice, so familiar, yet changed with time, filled the space between them. You wrote me a letter. Her grip tightened on the phone. I did. A pause. Eleanor closed her eyes, waiting for the inevitable. Why now? He asked, his voice quiet, careful. She swallowed. Because I couldn't live with the silence anymore. Another pause. A shift in his breathing. I don't know what to say to you, Eleanor. She closed her eyes. I know. More silence. More uncertainty. And then, I don't know if I can forgive you. Her chest tightened. I wouldn't blame you if you couldn't. The honesty of it lingered between them, raw and unfiltered. But he hadn't hung up. And that meant something. Daniel sat in his car outside his apartment, phone pressed to his ear. Eleanor's voice, a ghost from a past he had tried so hard to forget. Hearing her again was like stepping into an old photograph, familiar, yet distant. I need to see you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He closed his eyes. Every instinct told him to say no, but something in him, something deeper than anger, stronger than resentment, knew he needed this, too. Against his better judgment, he exhaled and said, Where? Eleanor gave him an address, an old cafe they had once loved. A place filled with memories of rainy afternoons and whispered conversations. He hesitated before stepping inside. And then, there she was, sitting at a corner table, her fingers wrapped around a cup of tea, eyes downcast as if she wasn't sure she had the right to look at him yet. She looked the same. And yet, she didn't. Time had changed them both. She glanced up and met his eyes. And just like that, the past came rushing back. The tension in the cafe was thick, unspoken words filling the space between them as Daniel sat down. "I didn't think you'd come," Eleanor admitted. "I almost didn't." His voice was steady, but inside, he was anything but. A pause. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, "but I needed you to hear me." Daniel studied her. "All right," he said. "Then start from the beginning." She took a breath, and for the first time in years, she told him everything. This is just the beginning of their face-to-face reckoning. Their conversation will be filled with revelations, pain, and the slow process of understanding. I'll continue deepening the emotional weight and expanding their journey toward closure or perhaps something more. The cafe hummed softly around them, the clinking of cups, the murmur of quiet conversations, the occasional burst of laughter from another table. But between Eleanor and Daniel, there was only silence. She curled her hands around her cup, staring down at the dark liquid as if it held the answers she couldn't quite find. Across from her, Daniel sat stiffly, his arms crossed, his gaze unreadable. He had said, "Start from the beginning." But where was the beginning? The night she left? The months before, when she had felt herself slipping further into doubt? Or was the beginning something even earlier, the first moment? She realized she loved him. And with that love, the unbearable fear of losing it. She swallowed, her voice thin. "I was 22 when we met." Daniel exhaled sharply. "I remember." Eleanor nodded, staring at her hands. "And I loved you? I hope you know that." Something flickered in his expression, something quick and painful. "You had a funny way of showing it," he muttered. She flinched. She had expected that. She deserved that. "I was scared, Daniel," she admitted. "Not of you, not of us, but of what love meant, you. You loved me in a way I didn't know how to handle. It felt too big, too overwhelming. Like the more you saw me, the more I'd have to see myself. And I wasn't ready for that." Daniel's jaw tightened. "So you left? Without a word? Do you know what that did to me, Eleanor? Do you know how many nights I lay awake, wondering what I had done wrong?" Her heart ached. "It wasn't you. It was never you." He let out a bitter laugh. "That doesn't make it any better." She looked up at him then, truly meeting his gaze for the first time. "I know, and I hate myself for it." Daniel shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "Then why now? Why send that letter after all these years?" She hesitated, because even now, even with the letter sent and the truth unraveling between them, she was still afraid. But she owed him honesty. "My mother died 3 months ago." Daniel stilled. The anger in his eyes softened, just slightly. "Eleanor." She shook her head. "No, let me finish. She and we had a complicated relationship. She always taught me that love was conditional, that people left, that nothing truly lasted." Eleanor swallowed hard. "And when she got sick, I spent months sitting by her hospital bed, thinking about all the things I never said. And then, after she was gone, I realized I couldn't do that again. I couldn't keep living my life with unfinished words." Daniel sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "And you thought of me," he said after a long pause. She nodded. "You were the biggest unfinished sentence in my life." The cafe around them continued, oblivious to the storm that raged between them. Daniel exhaled, his shoulders dropping slightly. "I don't know what to do with this, Eleanor. I don't know if I want to forgive you. I don't know if I can." Her heart squeezed painfully. "I understand." Silence stretched between them, long and uncertain. Then, finally, Daniel reached for his cup, taking a slow sip before speaking again. "I think I need time." Eleanor nodded, tears threatening to well up in her eyes. "Take all the time you need." But deep down, she knew time wasn't the answer. The real question was whether time could heal something that had been broken for so long. Eleanor didn't expect Daniel to call. She didn't expect anything at all. But the silence after their meeting felt different from the silence before. It wasn't the absence of something, it was the waiting. The possibility. She replayed their conversation in her mind, every word, every hesitation. He hadn't forgiven her. but he also hadn't walked away. And maybe that was enough. For now, one evening, nearly 2 weeks after their meeting, Eleanor found herself walking along the river, the city lights flickering across the water. The cold air bit at her skin, but she welcomed it. It made her feel awake, present. Her phone buzzed. Her breath caught as she saw his name. Daniel. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she answered. His voice was quiet. Are you free? Her pulse quickened. Yes. Meet me at the bookstore on 9th. She frowned. The one we used to go to? A pause. Yeah. She hesitated only for a second. I'll be there. The bookstore smelled the same, like old paper and history. Like something timeless. She found Daniel near the poetry section, flipping absently through a book. When he saw her, he set it down. She wasn't sure what to expect. Then, softly, he said, I've been thinking. She held her breath. I don't know how to forget what happened, he admitted. But I don't want to pretend like it didn't matter, either. Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. It mattered. He looked at her then, his gaze searching. So maybe we start there. A small, tentative hope flickered in her chest. She nodded, okay. And for the first time in years, they began again. Unraveling the past, one step at a time. The next few meetings were careful, like walking across thin ice, never sure when it might crack beneath them. They met in quiet places, a park bench in the early morning, a small cafe where no one knew their names, the bookstore on 9th where they wandered the aisles, both hesitant and uncertain. Eleanor never pushed. She knew this was on Daniel's terms now. She had made her move, and now she had to accept whatever came next. Some days, he was guarded, his words clipped, his expression unreadable. Other days, something in him softened. Like the Daniel she had known before was still buried under all the hurt. But there were still things left unsaid. It wasn't until a month after their first meeting that he finally asked the question Eleanor had been dreading. They were walking along the river bank, the city lights reflecting off the water in shimmering golds and silvers. The air was crisp, the scent of autumn in the breeze. Daniel's voice was quiet when he spoke. Was there someone else? Eleanor stopped walking. The question wasn't an accusation. There was no anger in his voice, only a deep, quiet pain. She turned to face him, shaking her head. No, there was never anyone else. He studied her, as if weighing the truth of her words. Then why? Her chest tightened. Because I was scared. Because I didn't trust myself to stay. And because I thought if I left first, I could control how much it hurt. Daniel let out a soft, bitter laugh. You think that worked? She swallowed hard. No. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of water lapping against the shore. Then he exhaled. I think I wanted to believe you just stopped loving me. It would have been easier if you had. Eleanor's throat tightened. I never stopped. He looked at her then, really looked at her. And she saw the years between them, the hurt, the longing, the unanswered questions that had shaped them both. Finally, he nodded. I believe you. And somehow, that felt like the first real step toward healing. Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor and Daniel settled into something fragile but real. They weren't pretending the past hadn't happened, but they also weren't drowning in it. It was slow, careful, unspoken boundaries lingered between them, but neither seemed ready to let go entirely. One evening, they found themselves in the bookstore again, the familiar scent of old paper filling the space between them. Daniel picked up a book, flipping through the pages absent-mindedly. Do you remember the first book you ever lent me? Eleanor smiled faintly. Of course. The Night Circus. He nodded. I never gave it back. She chuckled. I know. I let you keep it. Daniel closed the book in his hands, glancing at her. Why? She hesitated, then admitted, because I wanted you to have something of mine. Something that stayed. His expression shifted, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. I read it again last week. Eleanor's heart clenched, and he hesitated before saying softly, it still reminds me of you. A warmth spread through her, unexpected but not unwelcome. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope. The breaking point. But healing was never linear. And some wounds, no matter how much time had passed, still had sharp edges. One evening, Daniel called her unexpectedly. Come over, he said. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something she couldn't quite place. When she arrived at his apartment, he was already drinking. Not heavily, not recklessly, but just enough that his eyes were a little too bright, his shoulders a little too tense. She sat across from him, waiting. Finally, he exhaled sharply and said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Eleanor nodded. "Okay?" His jaw clenched. "If you hadn't written that letter, if your mother hadn't died, would you have ever come back?" The question hit like a blow. Her fingers curled into her lap. "I don't know." Daniel laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's not the answer I wanted." She swallowed hard. "I know." He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "I keep wondering if I'm just a loose end you needed to tie up. If this'll," he gestured between them, "is just guilt." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "It's not." He looked at her then, his gaze sharp, searching. "Then what is it?" Her voice wavered. "It's me trying to make things right. It's me realizing I was wrong, that I was a coward, that I ran from the only real thing I ever had." Daniel stared at her for a long time. Then, quietly, he said, "I don't know if I can do this, Eleanor." Her chest tightened. "I understand." But it didn't stop it from hurting. The distance between them. After that night, things shifted. Daniel withdrew, answering her texts less frequently. Their meetings growing further apart. She didn't push. She had no right to. But the emptiness he left behind was unbearable. One evening, she found herself walking past the bookstore, hesitating outside. It had become their unspoken meeting place. The place where things had felt possible again. But tonight, he wasn't there. And she realized, with a sharp, painful clarity, that maybe this was the end. Maybe some wounds didn't heal. Maybe love wasn't always enough. Maybe she had been too late. Her fingers curled into her coat as she turned away. The city stretching endlessly before her. And for the first time in years, she truly felt alone. This is another pivotal moment in their story. With tension rising and emotions deepening. There's still so much to explore, whether Daniel can truly forgive, whether Eleanor can find peace, and whether love can survive the weight of regret. The weeks stretched into months, and the silence between them grew heavier. Eleanor tried to move on, but moving on from someone who still existed in the corners of your heart was impossible. She found herself walking past the bookstore too often, lingering near the cafe they had visited, waiting for something that never came. Daniel had pulled away, and this time it was her turn to accept it. She couldn't blame him. She had left him once, and even if she had come back, some wounds cut too deep to be undone. Some doors closed forever, no matter how much she wished otherwise. But she had learned something in all of this. Love wasn't about holding on to someone out of guilt or fear of regret. It wasn't about fixing the past or rewriting history. Love was about presence. It was about showing up when it mattered. And she had failed at that when it counted most. So, for the first time in years, she decided to stop waiting. She booked a flight to a small town by the coast, somewhere quiet, somewhere unknown. She found a job at a local bookshop, one that smelled of sea air and ink. And for the first time in years, she let herself be still. She stopped running. Not toward Daniel. Not away from him. Just stopped. Daniel's realization. For Daniel, the silence wasn't easy either. At first, he told himself he was fine. That stepping away from Eleanor was necessary. That it was the only way to protect himself from making the same mistake twice. But the emptiness she left behind didn't feel like relief. It felt like loss. He thought back to their time together, the laughter, the late-night conversations, the way she had once fit so effortlessly into his life. And he thought about the night she left, about the years that followed, where he convinced himself she didn't care. But she had come back. She had tried. And he had been so focused on his pain that he had never stopped to ask himself, had he ever truly let her in to begin with? Had he ever given her a place to stay? Or had he only ever been afraid of losing her? Because love wasn't just about being left behind. It was about understanding why someone left in the first place. And maybe, just maybe, he had never really given her the safety to stay. The realization hit him harder than he expected. And for the first time since she had written that letter, he knew exactly what he needed to do. Eleanor sat on the porch of her small coastal home, watching the tide pull in. The sky was streaked with the soft hues of twilight. And for the first time in years, she felt at peace. Then, one evening, a letter arrived. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her breath caught as she unfolded the paper, her fingers trembling slightly. It was from Daniel. "Eleanor, I spent years believing the past had to stay in the past, that what was broken couldn't be unbroken, that love, once lost, could never truly return. I thought forgiving you meant erasing the hurt, but I was wrong. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing to move forward despite the pain. You once asked me if I could ever forgive you. I think the real question is, can we forgive ourselves? Because I see it now, Elana. We both ran. You ran because you were afraid of losing me, and I ran because I was afraid of loving you too much. I don't know if we can ever go back to what we were, but I know this. I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering, what could have been? So, I'm asking, not for us to rewrite the past, but for a chance at something new. If you still believe in us, meet me where it all began. I'll be waiting. Daniel. Eleanor stood at the train station, heart pounding, fingers clutching the letter in her hands. She had a choice. She could stay here, in the life she had built from the ashes of her past, a life that was quiet, peaceful, safe. Or she could go, not back, not to the past, but forward, to something new. The train's whistle blew, and in that moment, she knew. She boarded the train, and as the city blurred past the window, she allowed herself, for the first time in years, to believe in love again. Love is not about never making mistakes. It's not about always getting it right. Love is about learning, about forgiveness not just of others, but of ourselves. Sometimes we run from love because we're afraid of losing it. But the real loss is never giving it a chance to begin with. Love is not about rewriting the past. It's about choosing every day to keep showing up. And sometimes love's greatest gift is not in never leaving, but in finding the courage to return.